Okay, so happy Friday. Welcome to Talking Data Equity for Friday, April 21st. And my name is Heather Kraus. I'm the founder of an organization called We All Count. And We All Count specializes in building tools and working together with people who are trying to embed equity in the data projects that we're doing. In other words, align the choices and priorities that we are using to generate evidence, align that with the intended purpose and the communities and lived experiences that we are trying to uphold. If I look a little bit rattled, I am a little bit rattled, and that I'm a little bit rattled because our special guest is not here. So we are kind of trying to make sure that we didn't get any of our wires crossed. But I think we are going to go ahead with Plan B until, if you're a regular here at Talking Data Equity, you will know that this is an informal gathering. This is a come as you are informal gathering where anybody who's interested in data equity or working on data equity can come together and ask questions, share resources, and feel less alone. That is the idea behind Talking Data Equity. Sometimes we have a special topic, like we did small sample sizes, we did Bayesian analysis, and sometimes we have special guests. And today we were going to have a special guest, but it looks like some wires have gotten crossed or something happened and our special guest is not here. So we are just going to roll with it. And like all of you are saying in the chat, welcome to real life. Welcome to data equity. Welcome to what always happens, right? It's never, the plan never is exactly what happens. And that's one of the reasons that one of the tools that we use at We All Count early on in projects is called the Motivation Touchstone, where we document the purpose, why we're doing this, so that when things don't go to plan and we need to make changes, we can make those changes on the fly, remembering who we're trying to prioritize, remembering why we're doing this. And that is very useful to me because I am on the fly, remembering that this is an informal gathering of people who want to hang out together and talk about data equity. So really, this is all fine. And what we're going to do is we're just going to pivot. As people are saying in the chat, there is so much expertise in this room and so many interesting ideas that we will have lots to talk about. And one of the things I have opened up is the document that allows anybody in the public to submit questions. And what I have seen when I opened that is something that has been brought up also verbally a couple of times here, which is one of the things that we don't hear a lot about is painful experiences, failures, things that we have tried in our attempts to work on data equity and have gotten wrong. So I am going to start there because I think that that is a very, very good point that this person is making. We spend a lot of time talking about resources you can use and things that have gone really well, but equally important is talking about things that we have tried that have gone wrong, because we don't really want to paint a picture of everything that has ever gone right. So I'm going to start there, and then I'm going to proceed with the various questions and topics that you all are putting into the chat, because there are lots of them. Yeah, there's some great topics in the chat. So while you add your requests and stuff, I'm going to start instead of sharing something that's gone right, I'm going to share something that's gone wrong. And I've been doing this for many, many decades. So I am just kind of in my mind going through the list of all the things that have gone wrong. There's so many things that have gone wrong that have worked out really, really well. Um, and have really helped me learn what data equity really means. And most of you probably have already heard me tell the story about the first time I really realized that the many, many decades of fancy mathematical and computer science education that I had was missing a really important piece, which is when I was working on a project in rural Bangladesh. And I had worked on this project for a number of years, or not a number of years, a number of months from my home and my office in Toronto. And the idea behind this project was to improve the lives of women living in rural Bangladesh. And the training, the program was teaching women that owned cows in rural Bangladesh, kind of teaching them new ways to feed their cows, new ways to clean the cows, new ways to collect milk, new ways to sell that milk. And it was my job to take the data that this project was producing and tell them if it was working and which parts were working. And so they sent all this data to me in Toronto, and I did all this analysis, and it was, high end fancy analysis because I was, just off of a lot of graduate education. So I was doing fancy stuff with statistics. And then I got to go to Bangladesh and take my analysis and live and work with the people that were producing that data. And it was literally days after very short time being there, being in Bangladesh with my analysis and with my fancy statistical tools and with my laptop, and realizing that I would have no problem at all publishing the results that I was producing in a peer-reviewed journal article and attracting a lot of money from a lot of donors and things like that. But that the analysis that I was producing was entirely centered around my own experience, that it was centered totally around my assumptions about how the world worked, my assumptions about what success looked like, my assumptions about what a cow looked like. I'd grown up in Pennsylvania around cows, and I knew a little bit about the dairy value chain just from growing up. But the dairy value chain in Bangladesh, what a cow looks like, what success looks like, is extremely different for people who are living in rural Bangladesh. And it just blew my mind that this rigorous, reliable, repeatable, accurate, definitely past peer review statistical analysis that checked all the boxes was actually creating meaning that was harmful to the people that I was trying to make meaning for. And that was really the most important failure of my career. I mean, there are many. We could spend every Friday for the rest of our lives probably talking about the failures that I've done and been through. But this was the real one that kind of broke my heart and made me furiously angry at the same time. To be an engineer, to be to build the kind of engineer that builds bridges, you need to pass an ethics test. You need to pass an ethics test because if you decide to use materials that aren't the exactly best materials in your bridge just to go faster or save money, people are going to die. And it's the same thing for data projects. And yet, I was never, ever asked to take an ethics class, to take even like a basic course on the human consequences of mathematical decisions. And some of the specifics, I'm not going to go too far into the specifics, but some of the specifics were things like there was this idea, part of what we were trying to do was improve lives through teaching women new ways to work with dairy cows. And what we found was our model was hiding the fact that they were producing a lot more milk, but they were producing a lot more milk because they were getting up in the middle of the night. They were getting up at 2 o'clock in the morning to milk these cows. And what we were actually exporting, we thought we were exporting a program that was like increasing dairy production. But what we were actually importing was a concept of like this woman that does everything and has everything and gets up in the middle of the night to be like this, North American superwoman model was one of the things we were exporting. Another part of the mathematical problem was that there was an assumption, it was partly economic empowerment, right? People will get more money. An idea that we would encourage and curate a situation in which women could make economic decisions on their own. And we were going to count that as economic empowerment. And when that wasn't happening in our statistical models, we thought, oh, this is a failure. But what actually was happening was the women that were in our programs didn't want to make the decisions on their own. They wanted to make the decisions in collaboration with their partners. And so, again, our data was counting a program as unsuccessful when it was simply not appropriate for the situation. And I know that people talk a lot about that in a narrative way or a conceptual way, like the ideas behind a program. That gets a lot of coverage. But at the time, the mathematical issues were not being covered. It's the way that we build a model is really going to embed either, my lived experience as a person who had never been to Bangladesh while she spent 6 months building models to decide if women in Bangladesh's lives were getting better or worse. That's a mathematical issue. So that is one huge failure that I have had. Again, I could go through dozens, and maybe we'll have a special episode of Talking Data Equity where I bring some more examples of times more recently that I was really, really trying to embed equity. There are times in the early days where I thought everybody should be paid for data. I insisted that programs pay people for data. That ended up messing with people's government benefits. It ended up creating a imbalance in the power dynamics of communities that I wasn't aware of or prepared to go the distance with. And so I've really had to rethink my attitudes about should people be paid for data? How should people be paid for data? And I've stopped making recommendations about this is what we should do always across the board, because I've realized that that's not possible. Whether or not a person should be paid for data needs to happen in conversation with the program and the community and the people, not, some, equity best practice that comes down from somebody who isn't involved directly in the project. Yes, exactly. Excellent. Fabulous. I'm just deciding if I'm going to, I don't know. I don't want to take up the whole time. I know that my anxiety will cause me to talk for the whole hour, and I do not want to talk for the whole hour and give in to my anxiety. So I'm going to stop talking. I have many more failures I can share. Maybe we will do a lessons learned the hard way talking data equity. But instead of letting my anxiety take over everything and having me talk for the whole time, I'm going to say, if you have a question you want to ask the group, not just me, but the group, raise your hand and we'll unmute you. And if you have an experience that you want to share, an experience of success, an experience of struggle that you want to share, also go ahead and raise your hand. And in the meantime, I'm going to look through the chat. Kim. Oh, go ahead. Mish. Hey, Mish.
Hello, I'm going to undo myself. So I don't necessarily have a success or failure, but what I just want to say, I hear you talk all the time, and I love this space. And it's because of this space that I've added a new component to my consulting to support those in this work. But the reality is that when we fail, we learn. I mean, I hear you saying that you have a lot of failures, but without your failures, we wouldn't have Heather Kraus, who comes and brings and does. And I think this is really important. And I won't go into detail tons today because I know I get a chance to present. But I think that when we don't understand that we are each of us data points, when we separate the humanity from the data points, we forget that we're interconnected. So if you fail and you learn something, just like when we study like disease or things that, heal disease, I really think of inequity or the construct of it as a disease. And so when you fail, you teach us something about how to interact. And so I think for me, there's a piece that we miss from this work. And that piece is, how do we hold each other in sanctuary so that we can fail, so that we can figure out how this is? How do we help each other? This work can be soul crushing. And so if we really separate ourselves, I think, from data points as people, as humanity, as living, breathing things, even if it's a part of the earth, I think that's how our algorithms go awry. And I'm not saying I have all the answers. I have thoughts and ideas. And again, I won't go into them today, but I just wanted to put that out there for you, Heather, that there is beauty in failure. And
thank you so much, Mish. Honestly, as I was figuring out that I think our special guest wasn't coming and I saw you come in through the waiting room, I was so happy. I was like, oh, good. Because you're always so brave and willing to unmute and come on to onto the camera and share your wisdom. And like Mish said, they are coming as a special guest in a week or two, so we're gonna get the full treatment. But I really appreciate what you said, because it is one of the things that we all count is really trying to figure out how to do is not so much share our own failures. We're pretty good at that, or our own lessons learned, as Artrice is saying in the chat. But one of the things what we run into a lot is that when we're doing work, like we work with lots of, colleges or healthcare centers and stuff, and they're afraid to try things or to share with their colleagues that they've tried new things, because they fear if they got even one little part of that wrong, if they go back and say, actually, we think that this estimate that we have of, like the average cost of cardiac care at this hospital actually was really racist, and we're going to make it better, that medical school is canceled. And it's a real problem. And so we're trying to figure out, and we'd love to hear ideas. We try and set up cohorts where people can kind of learn in privacy, but there's so many problems with that too, that it's a really hard thing when I like the framing of equity as a disease too. That, we're never going to heal a disease in secret or perfectly at once. Yeah. Agreed. Do I have a lessons learned doc? Well, I think I have a whole lessons learned organization. I think we all count is like, here's all the things that we have done wrong, and that you might be able to learn from our mistakes. But maybe we're not as obvious but that it literally is a lessons learned organization of like, pretty much every tool that we have and every blog post we have, underneath of that is a story that we got wrong. A time where we did research that doubled down on white supremacy, or, went in and thought, we're going to partner with the Anishinaabe Nation, and we're going to do longitudinal work, and we're going to get a grant to do 3 years. And they just looked at us and said, 3 years is not long-term research. What are you talking? Like, it's so offensive. We were very offensive because we were, I was at that time very young and very stupid, well-intentioned, but 3 years is a cultural construct. And so, yeah. Yes, not acknowledging harm and failure is white supremacy in action, is something that I would agree with. For sure. Hey, Dennis, good to see you.
Likewise. Hey, hi everyone. Figured if you're going to be vulnerable, I might as well also and give this a shot. This was clearly not planned, so forgive me in advance, everybody. But I think this is a wonderful topic. And I'm not even entirely sure if failure is the best word for this. It's just, to sound almost corporate, it's a learning opportunity. But it is something that we all experience when outcomes are not what we expect them to be, or we learn something very different. Even writing general research papers where you have a priori everything that should happen, and then something completely left field pops up. And now you have to change things because you might have even written things ahead of time, which is not really always the best way to go. But you let the research guide your results. Anyways, this reminded me of an event where it turned out it had an equity component that I didn't realize at the time. This was even before I got into public health. I'm an epidemiologist here by training. My specialty is in social epi. But before this, I was working in bioscience, and we were making cancer medications. It was great, but we would have certain things going on in the process line that would basically cause certain failures. A batch wasn't made correctly, or somebody didn't do a regulatory requirement, didn't sign appropriately. Some things like that were constantly happening, costing the company a bunch of money, and management was constantly having heads roll. They developed us as a few of us as engineers so we can do the math behind it and figure out mathematically what's going on behind the scenes, what's causing all these failures to happen. They're firing people, and this is where the equity component comes in. The people they were firing were those at the lowest levels of income. It just, quote unquote, so happened to be. So, well, we were losing some really great and dedicated people because of these batching failures. So we did the math. I looked through and I can find, okay, well, all these events are happening mostly in this particular sector. So the idea is maybe you just educate them, which, side note, that's another long-standing failure from EPI, was that we just thought we could educate the world and fix everything, because clearly nobody knows what they're doing. And that's obviously far from the truth. But what we ended up doing was, along with this quantitative analysis, I decided to start asking people I was working with, these literally blue collar, they wore blue shirts on the manufacturing floor, these blue collar persons, what their experiences were, what they're seeing when these things happen, and going through the whole Lean Six Sigma process and all of it, but talking with them and saying, well, we understand this problem this way. Talk to another shift, they understand it a different way. And long story short, what we found was the documents themselves that the people were writing in were vague and misleading and open to a lot of interpretation for areas that should not have been interpreted. And then comes to find out the people who were writing them were higher up in the financial chain, as higher up in the occupational hierarchy, the high-level engineers who were making easily 6 figures. And turns out they were also being protected by their management, because if they had things that were going wrong, we'd have to rewrite this whole thing. We'd have to change our whole process. That's too expensive. It was actually less expensive for them to continue to fire people and bring on people who can come in at lower and lower rates. And it was just awful. But through the full analysis and the project, we found that that was a lot of the problem. And we finally got to hold them to account. And yes, the success there was that, yes, it did bring down the errors. We did standardize some trainings and do all these other things. But it made me realize that there was a lot, you really can't just hold one group of any population accountable for all of the misgivings that we see. And how that translated to me in public health was we would often demonize, we would point to causality. I was just having a conversation earlier where and sorry to get data geeky, but we're looking at crosstabs and talking about row percent versus column percent and why there is a difference and why that's important and how that drives the data story differently depending on who you're speaking with. And especially when you talk to lay people, it's, you want to be really careful on these interpretations. We had one that was tying a certain type of insurance to a certain behavior, and that could be very easily irresponsibly done. But by talking with the persons and asking them what their expectations were, what is that you're really trying to get to, getting down to the root cause analysis of it, we were able to find out a lot more than if we just ran the numbers as we were asked to run them. We don't want to say something like Medicaid causes this particular behavior, especially when it's something that could be a vice, and that's just awful. So what I loved most about that experience was that outside of just holding people to account, but it saved people from having to deal with the hardship of losing a job and having to go home to their family to say, I did something that other people have done and only I was fired for it. And that was just, it made me feel awful. And it's one of the top 3 reasons why I left that old field and moved into public health. And there are a few of my coworkers here that and I've said this before, is we were making great medicine and it was working really well, but only for those that could afford it. And that eventually gnawed at me and said, I can't do this anymore. And I realized that's when I was thinking of disparities before I even knew what the word was. And in that process, the disparity was between people who could afford to make mistakes and those who could not afford to make those same mistakes. And it was a huge wake-up call. So, and I didn't get everything correct either, but it was fun to go through the process. It was helpful. It was equitable because those people now were able to continue their work and the other folks had to work weekends and, oh no, I can't go golfing this weekend. I'm so sorry. Yeah, well, you're coming in here on a Saturday. Too bad. If I'm here, you're here. Now let's go. But last thing I'll say there, someone else brought it up about making mistakes and having failures. And I said in the chat that there's also a great component to talking to who can make these mistakes, who is held to a stronger account for any error. Those errors are not distributed equally, and neither are there outcomes from them, nor to who is held to account. You and I, Heather, I'm looking right at you because you're on my screen. You and I may make the same exact mistake and have very different outcomes. One might get a slap on the wrist. Maybe there's a racial component, or maybe there's a gender component, or there's something else. It's not distributed equitably or evenly by any stretch. So it makes a lot of sense why when we talk about these things, it's very uncomfortable because now we're putting ourselves in a more vulnerable position. We're saying, yes, I am not infallible. I grew up having to be twice as good to get half of what someone else gets. I lived that. The imposter syndrome, totally real. But that eventually needs to stop turning inward and start turning outward. It's not me that is having a problem with being correct all the time, having to be perfect. Maybe the society needs to stop asking so much of us to where we can actually do what we need to do and be held to account, just like someone else who went to go play golf on the weekends instead. So I will stop there because I know I'm going to start rambling even worse. But thanks everyone for your time. And I hope we can continue to share these wonderful learning opportunities, these life experiences that will make us all better data stewards in the end.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you so much. I hope you can see the chat because I think there are so many people that agree with you. And I really am so appreciative that you were willing to be vulnerable and share that experience. I know you're not the only person in this room that's had that experience. And I think that you raise an incredibly important point, which is, yes, it is important to be able to talk about mistakes and turn them into learning opportunities. But the privilege to do that is 100% not equally distributed. And you're very, very much correct that people who are allowed to have their mistakes turn into learning opportunities versus the people who are allowed to have their mistakes turned into punishments is a lot to do with oppression and marginalization. And I think it's really, really critical if we want to move together towards data equity that we find a way to create that space where everybody is allowed to make a mistake and share it and turn it into a learning opportunity. I'm so, so glad that you brought that up. This session would not have been nearly as good if that really extremely valuable point hadn't been made. Thank you so much, Dennis.
Thank you for the opportunity. And just saying it that way made me think of our incarceration system too.
Oh, yeah.
That in terms of who's allowed to make what mistakes and what are the consequences thereafter. I'll leave it there.
Yeah.
'Cause that's a totally different rant.
It's a different theme, but it's the same topic, right? I really like the metaphor, or the not the metaphor, but the comparison, because it's easy to see in the American criminal justice system. And a lot of people, I think, that would say that they clearly agree with that in the American criminal justice system don't realize that it's happening in the American research system as well. That those rates are, they spill over into, who gets to try something innovative and who just has to repeat the habits of old. And who, such a good important point. Okay, who else wants to unmute? I think, oh, great. Melissa, go ahead. We would love that.
Hi, everyone. So I've been struggling a lot with creating, when something where social identity is so subjective and so culturally specific, should we even try to create meaning out of like global statistics? And if we want to do that, like, how do we wrap our heads around that? Like, if I say race, depending on what country I'm in, maybe they'll be like, oh, you just mean nationality. And another will be, that should be ethnicity. Country of residence even has been thrown in. And with these really like social identity, like things that are very tied to people's identity, how do we get at that and find disparities on a global scale and be able to compare them?
Anybody in the room want to take that? So you're looking for a unified theory of identity that applies to all humans across the globe. And that's the problem, right?
Maybe, but just some way to, like, is it useful to even do that, right? Maybe start there. Is it useful? Is it a goal that we should be working towards? Because, I think there are so many attempts to try to get at these questions. And then, I've tried to come up with questionnaires that will apply to everyone globally. And then arrived at, for social identity, we just need to take that off, right? But is there, like, should it be something that we're trying to attempt to solve for?
Well, for me, I try and work at that problem in terms of trying to get, for each project we're working on, extremely specific about what we're trying to understand. Because I don't think that using kind of broad concepts like disparities based on social identity, I don't think we're ever going to be able to even measure that in one country, much less in many different countries. And so I think it's really important to try and figure out what exactly we are trying to understand. What experience are we trying to understand? And are we trying to understand it about humans? Because for me, the kind of direction I'm moving in as well is when we're trying to measure disparities, we're usually trying to measure some kind of discrimination, disparate impact, oppression, and that's something that maybe measuring the people who are experiencing oppression is not the way to go. Maybe we need to get better at measuring systems, because systems of oppression and systems of colonialization and systems of dominance, they're really common across the world. Like it's very easy to figure out how to measure a system of oppression across different places. It's much easier. And I wonder if that's what we should be struggling to measure, rather than struggling to measure like, what are the exact nuanced self-identities of the people who are experiencing oppression? Because I think A, that's going to be much harder, and B, I'm not sure it's going to lead us to a solution. But I am not the only person in this room. Who else has ideas?
I'll say I have tried to go the access route with like, how often do you travel or things like that to try to get at how like your level of disparity, and have gotten pushback of like, these are not the same thing, and have had trouble like selling that as a concept
Mhm.
if people want to ask more about social identity. So I know this is like turning into a very
Yeah.
specific topic, but
No, okay.
like I think any ways to present that to stakeholders would be really helpful too, because that makes so much sense to me.
Hmm. Yeah. Anyone else want to either unmute themselves to talk about a response to Melissa's question, or share about a
I don't
success or a failure? Yeah, go ahead.
to Melissa's point, I don't actually think it's that simple. And I do, but I wanted to say something because I really feel that your question is extremely valid and quite important in today's world. I think it always has been, but just with connectivity. But I don't think it's that simple, and I don't think there's only one way to figure it out. I want to be very transparent, though. I think math is magical, and so sometimes it takes people a little bit of time to catch up. But I have a cool group of friends who are even more brilliant than me, I think. So I'm happy to have more conversation with you like at another time, but I think that it's a valuable question. I think it's very pressing, but I don't think it's a simple answer.
Thank you. Thanks.
Okay, go ahead, Ophelia. Maybe not Ophelia. Oh, it may have frozen. Is there anybody else that can hear Ophelia? No, we can't hear you. No. It looks like you're unmuted. Okay. Oh, I'm sorry to hear that. Okay, we'll wait and see what Ophelia has to say in the chat. Oh, hey, Wendy.
Hi, I was just thinking about what Melissa was asking about, and of course, I don't have any answers per se, but I was thinking about two sides of it. And one is, that identity is so context dependent that I don't work globally like many of you do. But I can imagine for a particular purpose that there could be a reason to collapse across, identity categories across nations and cultures and things. But I mean, it's sort of, again, since I'm not working at that level, then I have a very limited understanding of how one would do that well, because it feels so much like to do equitable work and to understand data in a way that's productive toward equity, that it needs to, like, identity categories particularly need to come out of the communities, they need to be meaningful, and the language needs to come out of the communities about which they're being used to describe. And so, so that I just think there's probably a tension in there. And then I was thinking also about what you were saying about measuring the systems of oppression and how there are commonalities, and thinking, like, again, you have to think about what's the specific instance, right? What is the research or the evaluation being done? But looking at, like, we try to look at systematic biases and making systemic change, and so we look at policies and look at patterns of participation in the things that matter, or like what Dennis was talking about earlier, patterns of you could look at patterns of attrition, either by choice or not by choice, things like that, I think also can help get at system. So I think it's a very interesting conversation, and I don't know that I'm adding anything specific.
You
but
are.
I want to kind of let it lie, because I think there's, it attends to a lot of things we talk about also in here on a weekly basis. Thanks.
Mhm. Thank you so much, Wendy. I really appreciate it. You absolutely are adding important pieces. And I really resonate with something that you said about being very careful about what we're, if we're going to try and standardize social identity across contexts, and somebody is saying in here in the chat, also reality is social. I'm not an expert on this. Too bad we don't have somebody like AJ with us today, or maybe there is somebody here, but it seems to me like, since we have now realized that the concept of being Black was created by people who were white in order to put a certain social identity and economic identity onto people, I think we should be very careful about wanting to standardize social identity, because we have direct evidence of how bad that can be, and how bad that can be. And again, I am not an expert in that field. This is one of the things that is weird to be me. I'm a mathematical statistician trying to figure out how to use my tools, not as weapons. So I know that there are people on this call, and certainly people in the world, that are much, much better at understanding, like, the ethics and the sociological implications of how race came to even be data that we collected. But I'm not really sure it's something that we want to spread out and export. And even if it's not race, like, what else are we doing accidentally? Sophia, hey.
Hello. Oh, the camera's much higher up than I thought it was. Yeah, just wanted to second that and go off of that. I am by no means an AJ, but I did do my undergrad in women's and gender studies. And so we talked a lot about things like this, and it was really making me think of something that you just touched on, which is asking ourselves why we're collecting data, especially if it's about social identity, especially if it's about subjugated populations based on social and political identity, because like the example that you gave, information collected about minority populations has often been done for weaponized and harmful purposes. And so rightfully so, a lot of those groups are wary of having their information collected, and sometimes having anonymity and having invisibility can be bad. It means you don't get resources, but it can also be a protective factor, right? Because if you believe that the institution or institutions collecting that information are not going to use it in your best interest, or it could be used against you, then having your information not collected and being part of that data gap can actually be a protective thing. And so, yeah, when we're looking at should we be gathering information about large groups of people, social identities across contexts, I think first understanding internally and connecting to your piece on motivation touchstones, knowing internally why we're doing that first, and then also communicating that really clearly upfront with those populations externally and asking them what they think of that why. And how they think that might affect them positively, negatively, or otherwise before making those choices. Because sometimes more information on certain populations isn't a good thing and isn't a beneficial thing.
I'm so glad you phrased it that way, Sophia. Is it Sophia? Is that the correct way to say your name?
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, I'm so glad that you phrased it that way, because especially when you're a researcher who loves data, you can think that, more data is going to solve a problem. And there's actually very little evidence for that. And there's a ton of evidence for how carefully, exactly what you're saying. There's a lot of examples we can look at about how collecting data harms people. And who gets to decide whether that data is collected is really important. The actual concept of informed consent, not like, what we have right now, which is in most cases not informed consent. Somebody is commenting about places in the United States that are collecting data right now on transgender status or LGBTQ plus status. Of course, there's an impulse to collect that information to see if we're treating people with care, treating people with respect, distributing resources equitably. And that is a really good impulse, but we have already currently seen cases where that data is used to harm people. And it is a very, very hard problem. Yes. Oh, hey.
Hi. I just wanted to, I've been thinking about this conversation all since joining, and I'm thinking a lot of things. I guess one is that we're in this kind of binary place of what is a solution or a problem, as opposed to what it really is. And even your story in the very beginning, it's that like savior design, or it's like championing this people saving themselves. But that's not how the world works. It's like this. We all have to, help and be helped at the same time. And then even in this conversation, if we're thinking, how do we get the information, but I think it's all as we navigate this space and say, okay, this particular project, I need more voices than just mine. I need to be in group conversation, even with the people who I don't always agree with, and they make me feel prickly and feel like I slow me down. I have to bring them in because they're saying something that is relevant to what we need to get done and how we're going to get it done. And so I, often I never feel kind of like, ooh, this is so heavy, so hard when I leave that. But I feel like this conversation is one that feels kind of heavy, but it doesn't have to be. We don't have to be mired in the oh my God, how do we boil the ocean? We're not boiling the ocean. We all have
Right.
our individual pieces in this. We all have our individual projects, you know, our work, the people we're engaging. And so really my job is to boil this teacup right now, you know, and that's what I can do. And so if I'm boiling my teacup and you're boiling your teacup and you're boiling your teacup, then we have a pond maybe that we're boiling, you know, and then that pond can get bigger. So let's not be discouraged that, oh my God, we can't solve this. No, we can't. I can't solve this by myself and you can't solve this by yourself. But the more voices that we get into the space, we can at least do something different than what's been done and done to us. Because yes, data is being collected about transgender and LGBT, and there's 300 legislation acts happening right now against my people, you know, like against
Mhm.
the LGBT. And so how do we use our work to undo that, to make that different? That's what we can do. We have that power. So that's what my thinking is.
I might be breathing out for the first time in an hour. Thank you so much. How do I pronounce your name? Artrice?
That's correct.
Artrice. Okay, thank you. Really appreciate that. I think that might be the place to end, actually. We try and end at 5 of, so that nobody has back-to-back Zooms. And I cannot honestly think of a better sentiment to end this amazing session on. Artrice, thank you for having the last word. Really, really grateful. Love the teacup analogy and think it's genius. We will end it here. This has been a great Talking Data Equity session. There is a special guest next Friday. Next Friday, we have Michelle Sisa. Michelle is going to join us from the Muskeg Lake Cree Nation, and she is going to share with us her expertise on how to write data stories that include Indigenous data. And how to, I'll just leave it at that. And so that's the plan for next Friday. Of course, we all know plans are TBD, but I really, really appreciate all the generosity and grace in your sharing and your listening today. This is a really amazing group of people. And I think if we all just pick up our teacup, as Artrice has said, and boil our teacup, that's kind of what Talking Data Equity Fridays is for. So cheers and have a great rest of your day. Really appreciate the contributions that you all made. Talk to you later. Bye, everybody.